I'm with Motus. I've been with Motus for about 3.5 years. I've been in the industry for about 20. A little bit about my background. So I started in recruiting right out of college. And from looking around the room, I'm not necessarily talking to people who weren't graduating around that same time. For me, that was June of 1991. And some of you might remember at that time, it was also a pretty difficult, challenging economic time. It was the early 90s recession. So I went right into recruiting, which is a fairly unusual career path, actually, at the time. There hadn't been the proliferation of agencies and recruiting and staffing firms, and frankly, I would go to a dinner party, and someone would say, "What do you do?" And I would say, "Well, I'm a recruiter." And they would say, "For the Army?" And I would say, "No, I find jobs for people, people for jobs," and then their typical response was, "Oh, you're a headhunter." And my retort was always, "I usually bring the whole body." So I did that for about 5 years, perm placement only, all in the Portland market. Left there, took some time off, had my daughter, and I rejoined the recruiting industry in March of 2009, which some of you might remember was another pretty deep recession. In fact, it was called the Great Recession. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute. For whatever reason, I seem to be attracted to this business during some really challenging times. So I've seen markets that are similar to this, but honestly nothing quite like this. So that's a little bit about me. A little bit about Motus. So we were established, founded in 2006 by a gentleman named Orlando Williams. He is our CEO as well as our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. But what we specialize in is delivering diverse recruiting tools, skills, and candidate pools to several sectors. We focus on government, nonprofit, utility, energy, healthcare, financial services, and technology. Our slogan is moving people forward. For us, it's not a slogan only, it is how we go about our business every day. We are also certified Oregon MBE, and we are the only Black-owned staffing service in the state of Oregon, which, as you might imagine, following the death, murder of George Floyd, kind of changed our business practice a little bit, or at least the clients that were coming to us. But it's something that we've always focused on, really making sure there is strong representation for underrepresented populations. And that's a particularly difficult challenge in Portland just because of our demographic makeup here. So how do we recruit and retain talent in this labor market? And honestly, that's probably a 4 or 5 day seminar. That's a lot of ground to cover. But I want to start today with 4 main topics. So the state of the workforce right now and kind of understanding where we are, for the purposes of this, I have relied on Pew Research as well as the US Chamber and the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And a lot of that information, that data has been released as early as recently as October of this year. So it's pretty fresh information. Some of it's July. There was a big dump of data actually on Halloween. And so I spent some time the last couple of days trying to update that. So I want to talk about the primary drivers of the shortage. So you can't really talk about the shortage that we're having now without addressing what the global pandemic did to our labor market, because it was a massive, immediate shock. So the pandemic hits, and sort of immediately you have these steep job losses. Again, depending on the figure you look at, the unemployment rate shoots up between 13 and 15%. About 30 million people lost their jobs in 3 weeks. By the end of 2021, however, so sort of a year and a half later, we're in this period called the Great Resignation. So how did that happen? So jobs started coming back, and we had a record number of what are termed as voluntary quits. 47.4 million people voluntarily quit their job, which sort of killed the previous record that was 42 million or so from 2019. So voluntary quits doesn't mean that there are 42 million people that are not working right now. That's not what that means. What that means is there are 47 million people who left their job for another opportunity, which speaks to the issue you're having with retention. So when you have that many people leave a job, what that tells you is really a story of optimism. if you have people, and again, kind of going back through my history being in this business in 1991 for several years, then again in 2009 during a recession, I can tell you there were times in Oregon, particularly in 2009, 2010, where people held on to their jobs for their dear lives. You had unemployment in the Mid-Valley in Oregon in excess of 20%. So this statistic, while it is troublesome for you from a retention perspective, is actually optimism in the market. People feel confident that they're able to find work. They're not fearful of leaving a job where they've been 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and they're willing to make those adjustments to their career. So one of the other things that we're dealing with right now is labor participation is the lowest it's been since the early 70s. It's hovering around 62%. There are a lot of theories and reasoning why that is happening. You have some people suggesting that extending unemployment benefits too long and other bailout programs has induced people to not work. I'm not an expert. I think a lot of that is also political fodder back and forth. So I want to focus on what I believe are two of the primary drivers. What we know right now is we have 3.4 million people fewer working than we did in February of 20, just prior to the pandemic. 3.4 million people. Where are they? What are they doing? I'm going to talk about the two main components to this 3.4 million. Women are a massive contingent. 1.2 million women have indicated that they are not working because they do not have access to affordable, reliable childcare. That's nearly 1/3 of the people that are missing from the market, just in that stat. To understand how this happened, we look at the fact that at the outset of the pandemic, we had immediately, along with those 30 million people that lost their jobs in 3 weeks, we had 370,000 jobs in childcare immediately end. As of July of this year, we've only regained 79% of them. That means there's roughly 78,000 fewer childcare providers than they were pre-pandemic. So you have a shortage in the labor market. One of those drivers is you have a shortage of affordable, access, safe, reliable childcare for a good chunk of the working population to utilize so that they can go to work. I do want to mention that people of color, women of color in particular, were most impacted by this, disproportionately so. What we know is that pre-pandemic, more than 95% of childcare workers were female. 56% of those were women of color or people born outside the United States. And so that obviously is a disproportionate impact given that they only make up of 23% of the total workforce. The other primary driver to people not working is early retirements. So this chart, again, this is Pew Research, tags the major recessions. So the one I talked about is the beginning of the early 90s is up there. Then you have the recession, early 2000, pretty brief, pretty shallow recession. And then we have the Great Recession of 2009. What you see in that trend line is a steady decrease in retirements. And again, there's a lot of data pointing to why that happened, why that went that way. Most people assume that retirement investments had shriveled, shrunk, and people were no longer in a position to retire on schedule, so they pushed out their retirement. The interesting thing about this stat as well is that what we do know of all demographic groups, the only demographic group who has been increasing their labor participation since 2000 is the 55 and older category. And they've gone from 53% to 56% until this pandemic. And this recession, you start to see an increase in early retirement. So, so that is presenting a challenge. 3 million adults just 55 years and older were pushed into early retirement immediately during the pandemic. And the other issue we have, which I mentioned just because it's pretty significant, is the demographic of 16 to 24-year-olds has proven to be the least active in our job market. They've got a pretty significant shrink in their job participation. So all that to say, where are we now? The current landscape is, what we know for sure is, if every person not working right now today took a job, we would still have 4 million jobs go unfilled in the US. Wages are on the rise. There was actually an article in the Portland Business Journal just this weekend, I think, where they were talking about what was happening with wages with respect to retention, because there's a lot of upward pressure on wages. And again, the stats vary. I've seen a low of 4.2% upward pressure on wages. I've seen as high as 5.3, good midpoint, and also what the Bureau of Labor and Statistics are saying about 4.7, and that's likely not going to change anytime soon because we have inflation of over 8%. So that upward pressure on wages is going to be persistent. We also know that in Oregon we are faring better. I actually got a resource page at the back of this presentation that will be distributed to you guys after the meeting that has some resources listed, and there's an interactive map available at the US Chamber site that shows how many people are available per 100 jobs in every state. Oregon is actually doing pretty good. We have 82 people per every 100 jobs. By way of comparison, a place like Nevada is suffering through at about 40 or 41 people available for every 100 jobs. And then you have states like New York, they're running about 103, 104 people available per every 100 jobs. I think the highest I saw was Michigan, and it's like 117. And something you really probably don't want to hear, remote work is here to stay. So I want to talk about this a little bit. I know this struggle, not for you individually because I don't know any of you, but for my clients. I have this conversation literally on a daily basis. So let's take a step back and look at a little bit of the history of how remote work happened over the course of the pandemic. So initially, before the pandemic, Motus has a pretty good stable of clients. Mostly are housed right here in Portland. They're headquartered here in Portland. Their main operation is here in Portland. And maybe they have a footprint outside the state. We have one client, for example, who has a pretty significant 4-state footprint: Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Utah. Pre-pandemic, even for technology roles, there was a lot of reticence to allow remote work, even hybrid, part-time remote work. And even if they were willing to do that, the stipulation was that the candidate would have to be commutable to the physical work site, right? So there's just a lot of reticence. And Portland is not a big market from employees' perspective, right? The entire state of Oregon population is what, 4.4 million, 4.5 million, around there. Los Angeles is 18 million. So it's not a big market. We were limiting ourselves by geography. And so the pandemic happened, and honestly, for the first month or so, we were just kind of figuring out who could retain employees, right? So we do perm placement, we do contract placement, we do contract to hire. So at the time of the pandemic, we probably had 300 people out on contracts with maybe 30 companies. So we spent the first month figuring out, okay, which of these contractors could their roles become remote? Could they do this job remotely? And so we kind of went through that process, got those people stabilized, and most of our clients at that point had paused hiring, they had stopped interviewing, they had closed most roles, kind of going to see what's going to happen. So now we're 3 weeks in, we're 2 months into the pandemic, and people start thinking, okay, we're going to hire again. What's that going to look like? Well, we haven't figured out our COVID protocols, right? We can't bring people into our office. We don't know if they're going to have to mask all day. We don't know if we can socially distance them. I literally had a massive regional bank. I was on a call with their vice president of HR for 3 hours discussing door pulls, right? So you remember that. It was a struggle for everybody. Our HR manager struggled with, what do we do? How do we come back? So as you started to see the market change and businesses said, hey, we're gonna have to find a way to function, like this pandemic's not gonna end in 3 weeks, we're not bending the curve, we're gonna have to figure it out. They started opening up orders and they were willing to have people work remotely. But again, tied to the stipulation that they are commutable to the work site. So then this proceeds for about 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, and the labor market continues to tighten and tighten. And we can't find people, remote or not. We can't find them because they're not here. So then our clients say, okay, you know what, let's open up to our footprint. Like maybe the job is based in Portland, but if you find someone who's in one of our 4 states, Washington, Idaho, Utah, let's do that. And another client, and another client, and another client. And so all of a sudden the labor pool got really huge for us. It was like salad days there for a minute, right? I mean, we literally, it was a cornucopia of candidates. So then the clients figured out, you guys figured out, well, not only can we hire remotely, not only can we engage these teams remotely, the productivity is pretty good. So that stuck around. So I'm saying all of that because it's really easy to blame the candidates, blame the employees for not wanting to come back remotely. We're the ones that asked them to do it. We're the ones that hired them remotely. We're the ones that told them they could stay remote, right? So this is a two-sided issue. With respect to the candidates, how they feel about it, Yelp did do a poll. 91% of people surveyed said they are really hoping that at least part of their time can be spent working remotely. And 30% of people polled said if they are required to go back in office, they will look for other work. Good news. Bad news. They have options, right? When you have a labor market as strong as it is, the likelihood they're going to be able to find a company, maybe that's in Portland, maybe it's not, that will offer them employment, that will offer them the flexibility to do hybrid, I turned my head apparently, is pretty high. So the chances are they're going to get that ask met, if not by you, by someone else. So that's kind of the state of the economy. Looking at your faces, it's kind of a downer. So I know it's hard. I know a lot of it, as I was preparing this, I'm like, I know they're gonna want good news. Like I'm gonna wanna give them something to like, woo, but it's hard, it's just hard. So what I wanna move on to now is realistic recruiting. And what I mean by that is where do you find candidates? How do you locate them? And it's kind of nuts and bolts recruiting. Again, this could be a 4-day seminar. So I thought the best way to start here, since some of you may not have ever recruited, your hiring managers, you've participated perhaps in the interview process, but never the actual recruiting process, that we might start with a glossary of terms. So the infamous unicorn, also known in our industry as a purple squirrel. Fun story, years ago, another staffing firm that I was running, I actually got a lawn ornament that was a squirrel, painted it purple, and used it as an award for my team. So purple squirrel really is just a candidate that you cannot find, right? For whatever reason. It could be that you've got a very specific skill set you're looking for that's incredibly high demand, and they're just difficult to find. Internal talent acquisition are recruiters that work inside your organization. External partners is everyone not in your organization, so firms like ourselves, Motus, and others who I won't name for obvious reasons. Direct sourcing. Direct sourcing is actively seeking candidates. This is the thing that most internal recruiters, most companies do not do, and if they do it, they don't do it well. Direct sourcing is really something that external recruiters do quite often. It is our normal course of work. Post and pray, one of my favorite terms. By the smiles and the nods, you've all done it. How's it working? Yeah, so post and pray, so I literally could talk about just this for about an hour. What I want to say first is, again, if you're filtering through, Oregon's doing better than most, right? 82 candidates for 100 postings. It's not great, but it could be worse, right? You are going to get responses to your ads. That is going to happen. Are they going to be the caliber of who you're looking for? Are they going to be the best fit for what you're looking for? I can tell you just anecdotally, and I say anecdotally, I've got the data, I didn't add the data. I'll talk more about that later. We track analytics for a lot of reasons. It's our business, right? Finding candidates is our business. So our ROI is tied to how many candidates can we find and how many of those candidates it take to fill an order. And how long does it take us? And what is our acquisition cost? Advertising is probably the cheapest way to go find an employee. So we're going to do it. Even if we're not getting a result on it, we're going to do it. In fact, a fairly large piece of our business is retained search. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of that right now because that's a whole other conversation. But retained search, we advertise those roles. Do we fill those roles from those ads? Nope. But we put them out there. And we put them out there because that's part of branding. There's social media. Elizabeth may get up later and talk about that. She's not going to. So that's our communications manager. So in any event, ads work. They're not the most effective. We're going to talk about why ads aren't super effective and how you might actually make your advertising more effective as well. So post and pray, again, it's kind of self-explanatory. The one part I do want to talk about really quick is it's not just advertising on Indeed, LinkedIn, ZipRecruiter, pick your poison. A lot of companies are only advertising on their career website and then trying to drive traffic there. Good luck with that. Unless you're a Nike, right? Or an Airbnb or Google, Amazon, the people that have to fight off resumes with flamethrowers. Okay, so why you may not be seeing results on your ads. When you have an opening, it happens one of two ways typically, right? You either have growth that requires you to add to your team for additional work, projects, or you have attrition, someone's leaving. So what I'm going to recommend to you before you put up an ad is that you ask yourself some questions, that you ask your team and your hiring manager some questions. First question to ask yourself is, are the job requirements realistic? So I've kind of sped ahead here. So let's assume you have a person that's leaving the job, they've given you 2 weeks notice, you panic, you go to your HR manager and say, hey, I need a job description. They go into their file electronically, they grab a job description that's probably been circulating around your company for a good 5 to 6 years, maybe longer, who knows, right? Or maybe they go and they Google and we've all done it, pick and pull pieces off of different websites and try to cobble together a job description quickly. So I want you to start by looking at job requirements for the opening that you have and asking yourself, if you were that candidate, would you want the job? So quick story. About 3 weeks ago, I have a client who is looking for an assistant AP manager, accounts payable. And her opening is created because their company has decided they're going to do a lot of automation processing for their AP division. She doesn't have time to do that, manage that project, that conversion that's going to take a couple years, as well as have 8 direct reports. It's just too much. So they've created this role between her and her new role and her 8-person team. So I'm on the initial intake call with her. She's telling me, I need this person. That's great. I said, okay, I need the job description. She says, sure, I'll send that to you. So what she sends me is a link to their career page, which I go and look at. And it is I'm not kidding you, a 5-page job description. 5 pages. So I'm reading through it. I send her an email, hey, we need to talk. So I set up another call with her. And what was interesting about this AP assistant manager role, and there's a lot I could talk to you about with regard to it, but a couple things I think are really good points. One was they were requiring a 4-year accounting degree. No one with a 4-year accounting degree wants to be your AP assistant manager. Not going to happen. So, well, it might happen. No, just it won't happen. So don't go there. Second thing I thought was interesting on this job description is it actually said they needed to have experience with technical writing and they wanted writing samples to submit during the interview process. That's exactly what I did. what? So I call and I'm talking to her about that, and what had happened was she had the opening, they created the opening, HR created the job description, apparently right hand wasn't talking to the left hand, and they posted it up on their career page. So two things on that. A, obviously you want to have a second C on those job descriptions. Also, job descriptions are not ads. Stop doing that. Stop putting up ads that aren't ads, but are job descriptions. You have to think about people engaging these jobs. Most people who are reading your ads are doing it on their phone. So they're gonna pull up their app, whatever app they're using to look at jobs, and they're gonna scroll through, and they're gonna maybe do this like 4 times, and they're done, right? So that's maybe more than you wanted to know. So we can talk about that more later if you like in the question thing. I have a lot I can say about that. So another thing I find is interesting about job descriptions are requirements for years of experience. It's a pretty standard call, hiring manager on the phone. Hello, Mr. Hiring Manager Face. How many years of experience do you need? Oh, I really need 10 years of experience. Okay, so if I find a candidate who has 9 years and 2 months of experience, you don't want to see their resume. Oh, no. No, of course I would talk to that person. I just mean I need someone with a lot of experience. Once again, fast forward, go look at the ad they have up. They've got 10 years of experience in there. You're going to have at least half the candidates that are no doubt capable of doing this job self-eliminate because of that, right? And I can tell you, having been in this business for a really, really long time and having hired people on my team and managed them, the difference between no experience, 0 years, 0 months experience, and 5 years is quantum. That's a completely different animal. The difference between 5 years of experience and 8 years of experience, negligible. These are people who have seen a few more permutations and are probably making more money, but aren't necessarily going to be any more effective in their role than someone with 5 years. Also, we do know that, and again, this is a whole nother seminar, that bias language and heavy requirements in a job description will necessarily kill diversity recruiting for you. Many studies over years have shown women in particular, if they don't match 95% of the job requirements, they don't apply. They don't. So just keep that in mind as well. Have you assessed the skills and experience on your team? So again, our fictitious story, someone is resigning, let's say it's a team of 5 or 6 people, and who is resigning is maybe your most senior person on the team. Let's say it's an HR group, and let's say in this HR group, you guys are utilizing Workday, and the person who's resigning happens to be your Workday SME. Like they're your go-to. Like they're the only one on the team that knows how to engage this platform. So what do you do as a hiring manager? You call me, or you call your HR person and you say, hey, so what we gotta do is we gotta hire a person with 10 years of experience who's an SME in Workday, because we have no ability to train and bring someone up to speed on the team. So we have our team that is now going to have a giant gaping hole in it. You're super concerned. What I'm going to recommend to you is that you talk to the team that's left for a few reasons. A, part of employee retention is giving them the opportunity to upskill their abilities. So your choice is, right, you can spend 2 months, 3 months, 6 months searching for a unicorn that you may or may not find, or that you may find and accepts another role with another company, or that you may find and accepts your job but then takes a counteroffer. Like there's 1,000 permutations, honestly, of why your unicorn, even if you find them, may not ultimately fill your role. That's your choice. Or before you go hunting for that unicorn, take a look at your team. Give them the opportunity to step up. I guarantee you the expense that you have in maybe bringing an outside consultant to teach someone how to lead and manage, maybe the money you have to spend to send them some sort of technology boot camp to learn Workday or whatever system they need to learn, that investment is negligible compared to what it will cost you to hunt for a unicorn for 6 months fruitlessly. And there are costs to having a seat left empty, aren't there? There are some costs that we can affix a number two pretty easily. If it's a sales role, right, you can affix lost top line revenue. Other roles, it's less easy to put a hard number on, but what I can tell you at the very least, the people that are left on that team who are having to take on that additional workload are paying a price. And if you spend 6 months hunting for a unicorn, you may turn around 6 months later and instead of needing one person, you need 3. And last question on this is, how long can you live without this unicorn? Kind of talked about it already, but I want to speak to some specific conversations I've had recently. So you say to a client, you have an opening, when do you need someone in the seat? They'll say, oh, right now today, I need someone right now. Okay. How long are you willing to wait to find that perfect person? Well, I'm not going to hire until I have the exact candidate I want. Those things don't marry up, do they? Right? So you're either in a hurry or you're willing to wait forever. But you have to decide which it is. If it's an irreplaceable skill set, you have to find that, then that's what you need to do, and only you and your team can decide that. If, on the other hand, you're open to creative solutions, other ways to manage through that, you can probably hire quicker. Okay, we're going to start with some ineffective tactics. We've kind of talked about the first one already, which is waiting for people to apply rather than direct source. Quick pause on that. So direct sourcing is something you can do with both passive and active candidates. And in actual technical recruiter speak, passive candidates really are a beast unto themselves. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to say passive, meaning that these are candidates that aren't cruising your career page, they're not cruising ads, you're direct sourcing them. And we're going to talk about the platforms that you can utilize to do that here in a minute. Another ineffective tactic is asking your internal recruiters to source for a ridiculous amount of roles with this huge disparity in what types of roles they touch. Another good example, I was on the phone with the chief of staff for a large nonprofit in Portland about 4 weeks ago. They specialize in care for addiction, and they are retaining us to find their chief talent and culture officer. So ahead of that meeting, I took the opportunity to go to their website, look at their career page, see what they were typically hiring. They had about 45 open roles, which was significant because they only have about 300 employees. So that's a pretty good chunk of people. And what I noticed was about 85-90% of the roles listed were clinical in nature, which makes sense given what they do. And then they had a VP of technology and some generic accounting role up there. And both these positions had listed on their career page for over 60 days. So I'm talking to the chief of staff and we're going over this other role, and I say, okay, so explain to me these 2 roles that you have out here. Are these actually still open? They said, yeah, we're struggling. We're struggling really hard. And I said, how often do you guys hire technology candidates? Well, I haven't hired one in 5 years. And how often do you hire accounting people? Once every couple of years. So you're going to pull your internal resource recruiter off of pipelining for 30 plus clinical roles to go find a one-off you hire maybe once every couple of years. Most of you will engage an external partner at some point over the course of the next 12 months. What I'm suggesting is rather than do that ad hoc, rather than wait until you've had an opening for 6 months that you just can't fill, that you've been banging your head against a brick wall, not getting the candidates you want, or getting up to the point of offer and then losing the candidate, rather than go down that path, be intentional in that strategy. Start out your budgeting process with, hey, what does our attrition rate look like for the last 12 months, last 24 months? What do we anticipate it's going to look like now? How many roles and what types of roles do we anticipate that we will have to fill? And which of those roles should we start by engaging an external partner, because those seats will also be empty, not as long, and the roles that your internal team are working on, they can develop what we call a talent stream, talent pool, talent pipeline. And that is effort to curate those pipelines. So asking them to pull off that effort, to go find a role that they maybe have to look at once every couple of years is just not the highest and best use of that resource. So now we're gonna talk a little more about direct sourcing, IRL. I didn't know what this meant. Apparently that's in real life. So IRL, in real life, and digitally. So the two main networking in real life, in person, is utilizing your current employees for resources. So quick story, my husband is an aerospace engineer. He's a very specialized kind of aerospace engineer. He does NDT, non-destructive testing. He's been in that industry for 30 years. He has a list from several certifying bodies of every level 2 and level 3 non-destructive testing engineer in the country. And he has provided his internal talent team with that list. Do you think they're using it? So kind of a trick question. If they are using it, are they using it in a way that's most effective? So when you have a list like that, when you have a resource like that, you don't call those people one time, call through and, nope, I'm not available, nope, I'm not interested. And we're gonna talk about this a little bit later, how you initiate conversations with passive candidates. Once you find them, how do you hook them? How do you keep them engaged in the process? But that list is a list that you would work on for years. We have those lists. Our lists are sitting on our ATS. Again, I'll talk more about that later. So your number one resource that isn't a digital option that really costs you nothing are the people sitting in your organization right now today. What groups are they members of? Your second networking is wearing your recruiter hat everywhere. So I'm a golfer. We're on, I think, 70 rounds of golf this year, so a lot. I golf a lot. And I would say every weekend I pick up 3 or 4 names. In fact, in North Carolina, I ended up picking up a name for a guy who works in Hood River who's a CFO. Pass his info over to Orlando because we're looking for one of those. How do you do that? So in this country, right, wrong, or indifferent, you meet someone, typically the first thing out of your mouth after what's your name is, what do you do? What do you do? Who do you do it for? How long have you been doing it? You like doing it? You want to do something different? So the networking part of recruiting is something that we have mastered. And when I say we, I mean external recruiters. We're collectors of people. It's what we do. And could keep you bored for a long time telling you stories of people that I started placing when they got out of college in their first little junior accounting role. And I ended placing him in his last role as CFO over a 20-year period. We are collectors of people. By the way, not all of us are. Just a disclaimer, not all of us are. I happen to think we're really good. I'm probably biased. So on to online platforms. Literally, there is a deluge of platforms you can go out to. I've tried most of them. In my position with Motus, part of what I do is take a lot of sales calls. I take a lot of sales calls. And I'm always looking for that new thing. That new thing that is going to give my team an edge in getting to the talent first, right? So I'm going to start what I think is the most user-friendly platforms for non-external recruiters. LinkedIn Recruiter is probably the largest, biggest, bestest in the world. It's huge. To utilize LinkedIn Recruiter the way we utilize LinkedIn Recruiter is you have to have a LinkedIn Recruiter seat. So the things that we do in LinkedIn Recruiter, unless you have a LinkedIn Recruiter, specifically recruiter seat, you will not have access to. So you can use the platform, but it's not as effective in reaching out to candidates. And then Indeed, I put up Indeed because it's a super cost-effective way to advertise and also have access to a really large, robust database of candidates. So I'm going to stop on Indeed for a second. What I like about Indeed with respect to the advertising piece is it's very flexible in your spend. So you can set up a budget of, say, $2,000 a month, $10,000 a month. It doesn't buy you an ad, it buys you visibility. So if you're spending $5,000 a month and you put up 5 ads, you can also spend that $5,000 a month and put up 10 ads. All that will happen is the 10 ads will have less visibility individually than the 5, right? And so I really love the flexibility of that budget, whereas with LinkedIn, you have to buy a job posting slot. They run, depending if you're not buying them in bulk, probably $2,500 per site, and it's a year. It's not a month, it's a year. And you can rotate ads through that. It's just not as flexible, but there's some really good analytics behind it too. So back to Indeed with regard to the resume database, the reason it's so popular, the reason it's such a good resource for you is from the candidate's perspective, Indeed is an aggregator. Meaning that if a candidate wants to go look at a role, let's say they're a GL accountant and they want to go see what GL accountants openings there are, they go to Indeed, they put in that into their search, they can put in location or not, and then Indeed does the work of going out to all of the different sites, sometimes corporate websites, because you can link your company page to Indeed as well, and it will pull those in. So from a candidate's perspective, it's kind of a one-stop shop. So that's where we go for a resume database. And then ZoomInfo. Now I threw this up here because it's a non-traditional way to recruit. And it's something that maybe a lot of your organizations actually already have. So ZoomInfo is part of discover.org now, and they're actually a sales tool, they're a CRM, like Salesforce. What they're known for is their data. Their data is super, super clean. They're kind of the Cadillac in the industry when it comes to sales intelligence, right? So they offer a lot of pre-call research information for salespeople, initiatives, things that companies are doing. They also are an amazing internal roadmap of every business all over the world. So if I'm looking for a GL accountant who's got aerospace or manufacturing, I can go into ZoomInfo, I can search companies that are like mine or the company I'm recruiting for, and actually get a seating chart, an org chart of every GL accountant they have in there. The other good thing about ZoomInfo from that perspective is the labor market has been so tight that LinkedIn, we're finding that a lot of candidates are locking down their profiles. So you can see them, but you can't reach them. So they don't have a resume listed, they don't have any contact information, their profile is set up so that you can't even email them. What ZoomInfo offers is alternative contact information. So you can go in there, locate that same candidate, get a Gmail address or a non-work email, a work email address, and likely a cell phone number. Also, side note, ZoomInfo recently, about 18 months ago, launched a recruiter platform, which makes sense because they probably knew we were doing this. We were actually one of their beta test companies that engaged with their platform. Mixed reviews on it still. Yeah, good data. So the other thing I want to talk about with respect to passive candidates is that they require more touch points. I'm going to explain this graph in a second, but what I mean by requiring more touch points is most internal firms, when they identify the candidate they want to talk to, they make one outreach. They make one phone call, they send one email. If they don't hear back, I guess they're not interested. What we know from our analytics, and by the way, this is our analytics for, I believe, July from LinkedIn. It's one of the tables they sent us, one of the graphs, shows us that when we reach out to a candidate who is not expecting our outreach, our response rate is 22%. By the way, these numbers jump around all over the place on a monthly, quarterly basis. This is not a static number, but this is just, for example. One touch point, our response rate goes up to nearly 50%. 2 touch points, 63, and 3 touch points, 69. Do you have to do that? Do you have to make multiple outreach? No, you can make one, and it's going to work about 22% of the time. But if you're already there, if you've already found the candidate, you've already done that work, why wouldn't you maximize your return on that invested time by doing a second, third, fourth if necessary? So you found the candidate now. How do you get them to listen to you? A, have a compelling story to tell. This can happen when you have them on the phone. This can happen when you're at a networking event, you're a more social setting. You should have a 3-minute elevator pitch of why your company is an amazing company to work for. What initiatives you have going? What things are you most proud of? What do you love about your leadership, right? Distill all that down to about 3 minutes so you can have that conversation really comfortably. You want to talk about their goals, not the job you have to fill. So you get these people on the phone. What most recruiters do wrong, what most talent acquisition people do wrong is they call a candidate, the candidate says, hi, what can I do for you? Hey, I have this job. They don't care if you have a job, right? So you want to start with a conversation that is open-ended, gets them talking. And you want to be prepared to speak to details quickly. Passive candidates aren't interested in saying, I can't release my salary information. That's a dead end. That's a conversation over. They're not interested in you not being able to share with them your PTO policy, your benefits. Not interested. So you want to be prepared to have that conversation quickly while you've got them engaged, and you want to be able to follow that conversation up with an email in writing. They're going to want it immediately, and you want to strike when the iron's hot. They don't want to wait a week to get that. If you've gotten up to the point where you've piqued their interest, you need to action on it. Engagement and retention. So some of you, the more astute among you, are probably thinking to yourself, engagement and retention, wait a minute, we just found them. Didn't we skip the hiring part? We did, but that was on purpose. So what I'm going to tell you is that engaging talent and engaging your workforce starts before they're your workforce. That starts the minute you make a conversation with them, the minute you make a connection with them. You engage them then. So when I say your engagement starts with the workforce before you've hired them, a lot of that has to do with timing. If you open up a job, and whether that's with your internal team or with external partners, and we send you candidates or your HR person sends you candidates, and you don't review those candidates for 10 days to 2 weeks, like seriously, why? Why are you doing that? You should, when you open that role, you should have a timeline in mind. And if you've got to back into that number, go ahead. If you say, okay, I really need to have someone in the seat by January 1, what does that mean for your schedule? Does that mean you have to have an offer out because you're going to probably have to wait for 2 weeks' notice, right? So that offer's going to happen no later than the second week of December. And how are you going to get that pool of candidates? So back into that number. But don't open up a rec and expect to have submissions trickle in, and maybe you look at, I have literally had clients call me 2 months after submitting someone saying, hey, are they still available? Nope, sure aren't. And if they are, there's something wrong with them. You don't want them, right? Although, stat that I'm probably not going to have time to get to. Recently, last couple of years, we have found that retention of your most tenured people and your most recent hires is where you're most at risk. 1 in 5 new hires leave within 90 days, which is the other reason starting engagement from the moment you interview them through onboarding, through their first 90 days is so important. So engagement, starting with the interview process. Again, company culture is super important. What message are you sending about your culture, about what your organization is like to work with? That's your human resource team, talent, and hiring managers. And then I'm going to recommend to you also that you audit your company's application submission review and interview process. If you've got 8, 10 stakeholders involved in an interview, you're going to have to shore that up. If nothing else, getting that many people scheduled to align to interview a reasonable basket of candidates is a couple months, right? So I would recommend that you definitely take a look at those procedures and see if you can truncate them and make them more efficient and quicker. Time isn't on your side. If you've decided this candidate you want to hire, you need not delay. Obviously, you have to comport with your company's policies. If you're working with an external partner, I can tell you, our preference is always to let us present the offer for a bunch of reasons, again, that I don't have time to go into. When you make an offer, you want to make sure that you are talking about the full complement of compensation. It's not just their base wage, right? It's also benefits, variable compensation, PTO, and something I want to talk to you about really quickly to kind of strengthen the offers you're putting out there and some things that we're seeing pretty routinely now. When you bring a new candidate in, they have to reset their benefits, and a lot of times they're waiting 90 days for their benefits to start. A lot of companies now are offering COBRA bridges. They're paying that bridge as a hiring bonus to get people through that period so they're not going out without insurance or they're not having a huge expense to maintain their insurance. Another big thing that's come up, and I think mainly because this summer we were experiencing a lot more PTO happening during the interview process and shortly after hire, because I think there's a lot of pent-up demand after COVID, a lot of delay to travel plans, and so a lot of vacation was taken during that time. But something that we see a lot at the point of offer is a candidate has 3 or 4 weeks of PTO in their current position, and your company is going to ask them to reset at 2 weeks. Not in this market. Just not in this market. And I understand you've got internally equity issues where you can't like bring in new people and give them a better deal than the people that have been here for 5, like I totally understand that. But you've got to find a way to work that out because you wouldn't do it, right? If it were you, you wouldn't do it. I'm also going to tell you should pick up the phone. Whenever possible, you want that candidate on the phone as you make that offer. My preference when a client has a written offer to share with a candidate, I call the candidate, I set a time, say, look, I need half hour of your time. I'm going to send you a document ahead of our call. I'm going to walk through with you line by line. If you have any questions, we can address them then, right? So I think that's a good idea. I also think it's a very good idea at the time of that call to offer them an appointment with an HR professional on your team to go over benefits. Don't make them ask. Don't make them ask you to stumble through your benefits, what it's going to cost them when they start, what's the contribution on 401k. Just clear that hurdle for them and say, hey, we're going to set up an appointment with HR at your leisure. You can have a nice long conversation with them. Engagement does not end for candidates who are not selected. I cannot say this enough. So if I said to all of you, do you call candidates after you've interviewed them and you've decided not to hire them? And most of you go, yeah, we do that. Some of you don't. 75% of candidates surveyed said that they have not heard back from an employer after interviewing for a job. And that's just, it's atrocious. You shouldn't be doing it. Shouldn't be doing it. And by the way, having been in this business for 20 plus years, I have delivered thousands of rejections. And there's no sugarcoating it. It's tough. It's not a fun conversation. It's a tough conversation. Be tough. Make those phone calls. Be a person. Treat them like a person. Explain to them why you didn't select them this time. Explain to them that maybe it was a really close call, it was a coin toss, and that you selected a person, maybe in 6 months you'll have another role, maybe 90 days, you don't know. But you for sure want to provide them with feedback, and you for sure want to continue the relationship, which is the other thing internal recruiters just don't do well. And it's because they're functionally deployed, right? They're worried about what rec is going to open on their desk net, what role they have, what HR fire they're going to put out. We're collectors of people. So our ATS is bullhorn. When you call me and you say, hey, Lyssa, we need an HR administrator, the first thing I do is I call my team and say, who do we have? And who we have is in my ATS. Because just because we don't place them, they didn't stop being our candidate. And just because you don't hire someone, they didn't stop being a candidate for your company. Right? There's so much information out there. If you just put in LinkedIn Learning, for example, employee retention, employee engagement, you're going to get about 600 hits on seminars that you can take. I watched 12 of them last Friday. What I'm going to tell you first is that what will completely undermine any effort you make to engage your employees is burnout. Anything you do for engagement, you will lose if you don't address this. And there is a bunch of people suffering from this. Right now, I think Google in May released a stat that they had reached an all-time high in their searches under symptoms for burnout. It is a corrosive killer of retention. Don't do it, and don't ignore it. So what I'm going to tell you with regard to employee engagement, whether it's Gen X, Gen Z, I know there's a lot of that. We're talking a lot about that right now. What I will tell you, real engagement is not going to happen unless your employees are happy, they feel a sense of belonging, they believe that their work has purpose, and they trust you.